Okay, so for this deep dive, you've given us, well, like a really big one to tackle here.
Yeah.
We're diving into John Rawls and his big book, his famous book, A Theory of Justice, and using the revised edition excerpts you sent
Right.
to try and give you, the listener, a shortcut to, I guess, to understanding these really foundational ideas that Rawls lays out about, how a just society might actually work.
Yeah.
So our mission today is, I guess, to get you a solid grasp of like Rawls' core arguments.
Yeah. And Rawls, I mean, he doesn't mess around, right? Right
Yeah.
from the start, he just drops this super powerful statement, this idea.
Yeah.
It's not that justice is just like a good thing to have in a society. It's like,
This is foundation.
yeah, it's like foundational. It's like
Yeah.
as important as truth is for systems of thought, right?
Right.
You can't really compromise on it.
Right.
And, he says like an unjust law is only okay if getting rid of it would lead to even bigger problems.
Even worse injustice.
Yeah. Even worse, injustice, which is, pretty strong when you think about it, to start a book like that.
Yeah, it's a pretty radical place to start, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
When he says like social institutions, what's he talking about specifically?
Yeah. Yeah. He's not talking about your book club.
Right, exactly.
He's talking about like the fundamental structures that affect everyone's lives.
Right.
So, think of it like the big system,
The system.
how the political system's set up, how the economy works, the legal system, right?
The big ones.
These are the institutions that really kind of set the rules of the game.
Right. So it's not about whether, I treat you fairly or you treat me fairly in like our day-to-day interactions, but whether like the overarching system that we both live under, is that fundamentally just or unjust?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
And Rawls, he makes a really big point that these basic structures, they have huge, like lifelong impact on people. Right. So you could be born, someone born into one set of circumstances is going to have radically different opportunities.
From the get-go.
Yeah, from the get-go. Then someone born into different circumstances, and these really deep inequalities, they can't just be written off as like, well, this person worked harder or they deserved it.
Right.
He wants to get to the root of how these structural disparities come to be.
Right. So it's not just about individual responsibility or individual merit or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's about the structure.
The structure.
Yeah. Okay.
Huh.
So is he trying to like design a perfect society in this book from the ground up?
Not quite.
Right.
So he's not trying to make like a one-size-fits-all blueprint for every society everywhere.
Right.
He's really focused on what justice means within a single society, a self-contained society, what he calls a closed system, right?
Oh, yeah.
So he's bracketing off for now, questions about what's just within, your family or a small association or what international justice looks like.
Okay.
He says, let's try to figure out what it would mean for a single society to be just. And then that'll give us a better foundation for thinking about these other trickier questions.
Okay. So it's like, if we can get the core, right?
Yeah, the core.
Then we can sort of build out from there.
Exactly.
Okay. So we're looking at the core rules of the game, like for one society.
Right.
And his big idea, his famous idea, justice is fairness, it sounds like it has something to do with agreement.
Yes.
It sounds like there's some kind of like social contract idea going on there.
Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Okay.
So justice as fairness is a type of social contract theory.
Okay.
But it's super important to understand that this isn't about like a historical moment
Right.
where everyone got together and signed a contract to form a specific government or anything like that.
Right. It's not like the American founding or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's much more of a thought experiment
The thought experiment.
about agreeing on moral principles of justice, right?
Okay.
So, those fundamental rules for the basic structure that we just talked about.
Right.
And Rawls' question is, what principles would people agree to if they were in a very specific, very carefully imagined initial situation?
Okay.
And that's really the heart of his whole idea.
Okay. And that initial situation, that's the famous original position.
Yes.
With the veil of ignorance.
Yes.
I mean, this is really like hitting a philosophical reset button, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's a great way to put it.
Okay.
So the original position is Rawls. It's his like hypothetical setup to figure out what those fair principles of justice would be.
Right.
And the veil of ignorance is like the crucial ingredient.
Okay.
So, imagine like everyone who's going to decide on these principles, they're all behind this veil. And this veil blocks them from knowing anything specific about their own personal situation.
So they don't know if they're going to be rich or poor,
Exactly.
talented or untalented,
Right.
what their social standing is going to be.
Yeah. Any of that.
They don't even know what they think is a good way to live, right?
Yeah. They don't even know their own conception of the good, as he puts it, which is like, their own personal values and goals.
Right. Right.
The whole point of this is to prevent anyone from, cooking up rules that would unfairly benefit themselves.
Right. They're going to be biased towards themselves if they know who they're going to be.
Right, right. And so it forces them to choose principles that would be fair, regardless of where they end up in society.
Right. It makes sense.
Yeah.
If I didn't know if I was going to end up on the top or the bottom, I'd be a lot more likely to make sure that the rules are decent for everyone.
Right, right. Exactly.
But, okay, so they don't know any of those specifics, but what do they know?
Yeah.
I mean, are they totally in the dark?
No, not totally.
Okay.
So while they don't know specifics about themselves, Rawls assumes that they do have like a general understanding of how societies and people work.
Okay.
So, they understand the basics of politics,
The basics.
economics, social organization, a bit about human psychology even.
Okay.
Right. And they need this general knowledge to make informed decisions about what the best principles would be.
Okay, so they're not complete idiots. They just don't know about themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And they also understand that resources are going to be at least moderately scarce.
Yeah.
Right. And that people are going to have different ideas about how to use those resources, which is what he calls the circumstances of justice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So they're making these huge decisions with this general knowledge,
Right.
but without any personal bias.
Right.
So it's like they're designing a system for people they know nothing about, including their future self.
That's it.
Right. And Rawls even suggests that we can try to imagine ourselves in this position, right?
He does.
And see what principles feel right from behind the veil of ignorance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So with this setup in mind, I guess, he starts comparing his idea to other big ideas about justice.
He does. Yeah.
And one of his main targets is utilitarianism.
Yes.
So can you remind us what utilitarianism is all about?
Yeah, utilitarianism, as you understand it, is that a society is just, if its institutions are set up to produce the most overall happiness or well-being, you could say.
Right, the greatest good for the greatest number.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Everyone's happiness counts equally.
Yep. Yeah.
And you just add it all up.
That's the core idea.
Right.
And Rawls, he draws a really sharp contrast with that.
Okay.
So he says his view, justice as fairness, is not about maximizing some grand total of happiness.
Right.
It's not about taking this idea of how one person might make a rational decision.
Right, like weighing costs and benefits.
Exactly, yeah, like weighing costs and benefits, trying to get the best outcome,
right,
and then applying that to society as a whole.
Right, right.
And a really crucial difference here is that Rawls is saying you can't just decide to make some people worse off.
Even if it makes a bigger overall benefit.
Even for a bigger overall benefit, and that's a real core difference, that separates him from utilitarian thinking.
Right. So in Rawls's view, you couldn't justify sacrificing the well-being of a few people, even if it made the majority much happier.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
He actually argues that utilitarianism, even though it talks about individuals, it can end up not taking individuals seriously enough.
Like you're just a number in the calculation.
Yeah, you're just a number in the calculation, and by just adding up everyone's happiness, you might justify trampling on the rights of some people.
Right.
If it leads to a slightly bigger total.
Right. Okay.
And he insists that his approach, with the original position, the veil of ignorance, that wouldn't happen.
Right.
For him, these fundamental rights that are protected by justice, they're not up for grabs.
Right.
They're not just something you can barter with.
Right.
In this calculation of social benefits.
They're not negotiable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a big contrast with utilitarianism. Another big idea that he spends some time discussing is intuitionism.
Yes.
And that sounds a lot like, just trusting your gut.
Yeah.
About what's right and wrong.
That's the basic idea.
Oh,
so intuitionism is this view that we have these basic moral principles and we kind of just grasp them intuitively.
Okay.
But the problem, as Rawls sees it, is that these principles often conflict.
Right. Your intuition might tell you one thing and my intuition might tell me something totally different.
Exactly. Yeah. And intuitionism doesn't really give us a clear method for deciding which principle wins.
Right.
It often leaves us just trying to balance these competing intuitions without a real framework.
So it's like a moral free-for-all.
It could be, yeah.
Right. We all have our different intuitions, and there's no real way to sort things out.
Yeah, that's the worry. Yeah.
Right.
And Rawls argues that justice as fairness
Hmm.
tries to move beyond this reliance on just immediate intuitions
Okay.
by asking more specific questions. And in some cases, substituting like logical reasoning about what's prudent for this direct moral aha moment.
So instead of just trying to like weigh in the abstract, like, oh, well, happiness versus equality or something.
Right, yeah.
He's actually trying to think about like, how would this decision affect actual people?
Yeah. He's much more focused on what the effects on people would be.
Okay.
Yeah, rather than just these abstract principles.
Okay.
He also mentions this idea of a lexical order of principles.
Right. Like some rules are more important than others.
Yeah, some rules are more important than others. And, a good way to think about it, he doesn't use this example, but like think about a video game where you can't unlock the next level
Right.
until you've completed the current level.
Right.
Right? He's saying some principles of justice are just that foundational.
Foundational.
Yeah, you can't even think about the other ones until these are fully in place.
Okay.
And so this lexical order, it means that one principle has absolute priority over the next, right? And this is his way of trying to create a clearer structure than just the fuzzy balancing act of intuitionism.
Okay.
So he says, like, intuitionism can end up relying on these vague, higher order ends of policy,
Right.
which can actually just mask deep political disagreements.
Okay.
Whereas justice as fairness offers a more structured approach.
Okay. So all of this kind of groundwork leads us to Rawls's own two principles of justice.
Yes, yes.
So what's the first version of these that he lays out?
Okay, so initially he states them like this.
Okay.
The first one, he says, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others.
Okay. So that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But basically, everyone should have the most freedom possible as long as everyone else can have that same amount of freedom.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. The second principle, he says, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both, A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all.
Okay, so again, there's a lot to unpack there, but the basic idea is that while we might allow some inequalities,
Right?
they have to be justified.
Yes.
They have to work to everyone's benefit.
Yeah.
Especially, it sounds like, those who are worse off.
Yeah, and he's gonna get to that, how that works
Okay.
in a bit more detail later on.
Now, I do notice that in that second principle, there are a couple of phrases there like everyone's advantage and open to all
Yeah.
that seem like they could be interpreted in a lot of different ways.
Yes.
And Rawls himself even acknowledges that,
I think
right?
he does.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, he acknowledges that those phrases need some more precision,
Oh, okay.
and so that leads him to, refine the statement of these principles a bit later on.
Okay, but even in this initial four,
Yeah.
we can see some of his main ideas.
Absolutely.
Right. Like
Yeah.
a big emphasis on fundamental rights and freedoms.
No, yeah.
And the idea that while inequalities might exist, they have to be justified in a way that ultimately benefits everyone.
Yeah.
And that provides fair access to opportunities.
Exactly. That's the core.
Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into that second principle
Yeah.
and the whole issue of inequalities.
Okay.
Rawls talks about moving beyond natural liberty.
Yes.
So what's the system of natural liberty?
Yeah.
And why does he think it's not enough for justice?
No, the system of natural liberty is basically this idea of justice that tries to eliminate the impact of, social class,
Yeah.
inherited status on people's chances in life.
Right. So I shouldn't be held back just because of who my parents were
Exactly. Yeah.
or what social class I was born into.
Yeah. Ideally, everyone would have the same legal rights
Right.
and a fair shot at competing for jobs and positions. But Rawls says, even if you achieve this, you're still going to end up with a distribution of wealth and income that's largely determined by what he calls the natural lottery.
The natural lottery.
Yeah, it's the luck of the draw when it comes to your natural talents and abilities.
So even if there are no formal barriers, someone who's, just born with more talent or drive is still likely to end up better off.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And Rawls argues that this outcome, it's just as morally arbitrary
Okay.
as being born into a wealthy family.
Right.
Like, we don't choose our natural talents.
Right.
Any more than we choose our social circumstances.
Right.
And so he says, look, there's no fundamental reason why the distribution of income and wealth should be dictated by this natural lottery.
Okay, yeah, so we can't really say someone deserves to be rich just because they're really smart or really talented, any more than we can say someone deserves to be poor because they were born into poverty.
Exactly, yeah. He levels the playing field there. He also points out that, truly fair equality of opportunity is really, really hard
To achieve.
to achieve, yeah.
Okay.
As long as you have things like, the family,
Right.
because the family's inevitably going to influence how your natural talents develop.
Right, so if I have really great parents who encourage me to, study hard and practice music and all that,
Right.
I'm going to be much more likely to develop my talents
Right, yeah.
than if I have a really rough upbringing and I don't have that kind of support.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so it's not a perfect solution.
No.
Right?
Right.
Okay, so this brings us to one of Rawls's most, well, I guess, famous ideas, the difference principle.
Yes, yeah.
So how does the difference principle, how does that try to address the shortcomings of, like, this idea of natural liberty?
Okay, so the difference principle is Rawls' specific way of interpreting that second part of his second principle of justice. And essentially it says that social and economic inequalities should be set up in a way that they most benefit the least advantaged.
The least advantaged.
Yeah, so the people who are worst off in society.
Okay, so it's not about everyone getting exactly the same amount of stuff, but it's about making sure that any inequalities that do exist, they actually help the people who are struggling the most.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And he talks about like a perfectly just scheme where the expectations of those who are least advantaged are as high as they can possibly be.
Okay.
And then he contrasts this with a system that's what he calls just throughout,
Okay.
where, yeah, maybe, the better off, they do contribute to the well-being of those who are less fortunate,
Okay.
but that maximum benefit for the least advantaged hasn't been reached.
Okay.
And then, an unjust system would be one where those higher expectations of the some people actually make the situation of those who are least favored even worse.
Even worse.
Yeah. So there's this idea that you can have inequality,
Right.
but it has to work to the benefit of those at the bottom.
So it's a maximizing principle, it sounds like?
It is a maximizing principle, but it's maximizing with this very specific focus.
On the least advantaged.
Yeah. It's about improving the lives of those who are struggling.
Right. Okay.
And that's a key difference from utilitarianism,
Right.
which is trying to maximize this overall sum total.
For everyone.
Yeah, everyone's happiness.
Okay.
Whereas the difference principle, it has this built-in priority
Right.
for those who are struggling, for those at the bottom.
Right.
And Rawls points out that when the difference principle is perfectly achieved, it's actually compatible with economic efficiency.
Okay.
In the sense that you can't make those who are least advantaged
Right.
better off without making someone else worse off.
Okay.
So it has this nice kind of dovetailing of
Yay.
those two ideas.
Okay. Now, when it comes to, I guess, like how we share resources in a society,
Yeah.
Rawls uses this term, pure procedural justice.
Yes. Yes.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So Rawls uses this idea of pure procedural justice to talk about how we should think about the distribution of goods
Okay.
in a just society.
Okay.
And he contrasts it with two other kinds of procedural justice: perfect procedural justice
Okay.
and imperfect procedural justice.
Okay.
So perfect procedural justice, you have a clear standard for what a fair outcome would be, and you have a way to guarantee that outcome.
Okay, so like flipping a coin.
Yeah, or a better example that he uses is like cutting a cake,
Cutting a pick, right?
where the person who cuts the cake gets the last piece,
Right.
right? So they're incentivized to make it exactly equal.
Okay.
So that's perfect,
Okay.
right? You got a standard, you got a way to get there.
Perfect.
Imperfect procedural justice, you've got a standard,
Yeah.
but you don't have a guaranteed way to reach it. So he gives the example of like a criminal trial
Right.
where we want a just verdict.
Right. An accurate verdict.
Yeah, but the procedure isn't foolproof.
Right. People make mistakes, evidence gets lost, all kinds of things.
Exactly.
Right.
And so now, pure procedural justice, that's where things get a little bit tricky.
Okay, so where's the standard?
Yeah, the interesting thing about pure procedural justice is that there's no independent standard for a just distribution before the process starts.
Right.
So the fairness of the outcome depends entirely on whether the system of cooperation that produced that outcome was just.
Okay.
So it's about setting up fair rules for the game. Right.
Right. So you're not judging the final score so
Right.
much. You're making sure that everyone's following the rules
That's it. Yeah.
from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And so Rawls argues that, when it comes to distributing the benefits of social cooperation, there's no way to judge like a particular distribution
Right.
in isolation.
Right.
You have to look at the system that created it,
Right.
the legitimate claims that arise within that system.
Right.
And the justice of the distribution is really rooted in the justice of the whole system of cooperation.
Right. Okay. So it's about more than just looking at the end result.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, given that focus on fairness, on, making sure that things are set up fairly for everyone,
Right.
Rawls argues that his theory has what he calls a tendency to equality.
Yes.
How does the difference principle contribute to that?
So the difference principle, it really drives this tendency to equality by saying that, whatever advantages some people have, whether it's from natural talent or social circumstance,
Right.
they should only be used in ways that benefit everyone,
Right.
and especially those who are worse off.
Okay.
It's about, like, not wanting to be better off
Unless it helps.
unless it helps.
Those at the bottom.
Those at the bottom, yeah. And he actually connects this to the idea of, fraternity, like this feeling of, I don't want to have more unless it also helps those who have less.
Right.
And he actually uses the example of, like, the family
Right.
as an example of where this principle of mutual benefit is often practiced, right?
Okay.
Hopefully you want what's best for your family members.
Right.
And you don't just want to, hoard all the good stuff for yourself.
Right. Okay. So it's not about like making everyone exactly identical.
No. Right.
But it's about like a societal commitment
yeah.
to making sure that everyone gains from
So
the talents
yeah.
and resources that are available.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, all this talk about a just society brings up the question of, well, what do we as individuals owe to that society?
Yeah, yeah.
Rawls introduces this idea of a natural duty of justice.
Right.
And he contrasts it with this principle of fairness.
Yes.
So what's the difference there?
So the fundamental natural duty of justice, according to Rawls, is that we have a moral obligation to support and comply with just institutions that exist and apply to us.
Okay.
And this duty, it doesn't depend on whether we've, like, specifically agreed to these institutions
Okay.
or whether we've voluntarily taken advantage of their benefits.
Okay.
It's a duty we have simply as members of a society.
Just by being there.
Yeah, just by being there. Yeah.
It's like a basic, like, being part of society duty.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Okay. So what about this principle of fairness, though?
Yeah.
Is that different?
So the principle of fairness, that does depend on our choices.
Okay.
So it says that if we voluntarily accept the benefits of a just institution,
Right.
or we take advantage of the opportunities it offers
Right.
to further our own interests,
Right.
then we have an obligation to do our part
Okay.
as defined by the rules of that institution.
Okay.
So it's about this give and take. You can't just take the benefits of a cooperative system without also contributing.
Without contributing.
Yeah, your fair share.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So the duty of justice is kind of this general duty.
Yeah.
And then the obligations of fairness, those come about when we actively participate in a specific just system.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
Yeah, and Rawls really stresses that the natural duty of justice, that flows from that hypothetical agreement in the original position.
Right.
Right. Whereas the principle of fairness kicks in when we actually, go out and willingly accept benefits.
Right.
And once we have a complete set of principles of justice,
All right.
we can apply them without constantly going back to that original position.
Right.
It's kind of a one-time thought experiment.
It sets the foundation.
It sets the foundation, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, a just society, ideally, would also be a stable society.
Yes.
Right. But Rawls points out that just because things are stable, it doesn't automatically mean that they're just.
Right.
So what's his point there?
Yeah, he's saying just because, a social setup is in a state of equilibrium, meaning, no one really has an incentive to upset it.
Given their current situation.
Yeah, given their current situation,
Right.
it doesn't mean it's morally right.
Right. Okay.
Right. You could imagine like a really stable situation that's deeply unfair,
Right.
where people have just kind of given up hope
Right.
that things could be any better, and they're worried that any change,
Would rock the boat too much?
yeah, would make things even worse.
Okay.
So for a society to be stable in the right way, in a morally good way, that stability has to be based on the justice of its basic principles.